So Genesis chapter 6, we'll read verses 5 through 8 as our sort of text introduction. It says, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." And what a start to this record, to this history, to this story that's recorded for us. You know, here's this declaration that the wickedness of man was great on the earth. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. God has this sense, God presents to us this sense that he just thinks, I shouldn't have bothered making people. I shouldn't have bothered with this. This was not a productive decision. Now, I think God is presenting himself to us in a way that we can think with our minds and get some of the picture of what he is experiencing and feeling. But God decides that he's going to destroy man. Again, why? Because the wickedness of man was great in the earth. And every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. All men deserve to be destroyed. But Noah found grace. There's grace here in this story. Here's a story that God is going to destroy everything, and yet Noah found grace. Let's walk through it a little bit and kind of hit some of the high points. Of course, we know as it goes on here, there's discussion about what God is going to do, what God speaks to Moses about, all these things. But if you look in verse 17 and 18, there's this promise of destruction. It says in verse 17, "And behold, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. From under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. But with thee," he's speaking to Noah here, "but with thee will I establish my covenant. And thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee." So there's really two promises here. There's a promise of destruction, and there's a promise of God's protection. And a covenant even, this agreement, this contract, this testament with Noah, with this promise of protection. In verse 22, we see Noah's belief. Verse 22, "Thus did Noah according to all that God had commanded him, so did he." And the word believe is not in there, but belief determines action. Okay, if someone came to you and said, hey, the whole world's going to be destroyed in a flood, so you need to build an ark. You need to build a giant boat. Odds are you wouldn't believe them, right? You probably would not believe them. And so you probably wouldn't start building the giant ark. Am I right there? Because your belief is determining your action. And Noah here, good evening, sir. Noah here, he believes God. And we know that because he starts acting on what God has told him. Okay, so God says, look, I'm going to destroy everything with a flood. The water is going to wash over all men, all animals that have the breath of life. They're all going to be wiped out. And so you need to build an ark so that you'll survive, so that I can give you my grace, so I can fulfill my promise of keeping you safe through this ark. This is what he tells him, and so Noah believes, therefore he does. Let's see, chapter 7 and verse 5. "And Noah did according unto all that the Lord commanded him." Noah is acting it out. His actions are the actions of a faithful person, right? A person who is full of faith. His actions demonstrate that he has faith, that he believes God. In chapter 7 and verse 13 then, we're in Genesis. Brother Joe, Genesis chapter 7 and verse 13. "So then the waters of the flood were upon the earth." You see that in verse 10. Everybody goes in. And in verse 13, in the selfsame day entered Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and 3 wives of his sons with them into the ark. And so they go and they step into the ark. And I think sometimes when we think of trials that we have in life, and I think that we can look at Noah and the flood and maybe learn a lesson for our lives. We want God to keep everything perfect. We want God to keep everything just smooth sailing, no issues, no trials, no tribulation of any kind. But what happened here is God saved Noah. But he didn't do that by removing the tribulation and the trial. He did that by keeping him safe in the tribulation, in the testing, in the trial. Noah was there on the earth experiencing the tribulation, but he was kept safe. We are probably never going to go through anything like the flood in our. I say probably. Let me rephrase that. We're never going to go through anything like the flood in our lives, where all men and land creatures. If you were to look in verses 21 through 23, it talks about this. Everything, all flesh died that moved upon the earth. Verse 21. Verse 22. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life, and all that was on the dry land died. Everything is destroyed. But again, here's this demonstration that no matter what the circumstances, yes, God may not remove us completely from the difficulty. Testing, trial, tribulation may occur, but even in the middle of the worst destruction, God can preserve his people however he should choose to. He had Noah build a wooden boat as he smashed the entire earth with water. And this is the means that God chose to use to save it. And in chapter 8 and verse 1, there's this phrase here. In Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, it says, and God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. And so here's the sense that, look, all this is happening. There's destruction. And you can almost picture Noah and the ark just being tossed and tumbling and swirling, right? The deep was broken up, and water surged up out of the earth. Okay, this was not a smooth ride in the ark. Okay, it's not like they were just sort of hanging out in a luxury hotel while everything's getting destroyed around them. No, they're experiencing everything that's happening. And God remembered Noah. He knows he's in there, and I've kept him safe there. He's preserved, and he is saved in the ark. And he thinks his mind is on Noah. And we could go on. We could look at the time frames of the water, of the rain, of the different things. We could look at the types of birds, the days in between. We can see the picture of the dove carrying, peace in the form of the olive branch, right? That's where that comes from. When you see the dove carrying an olive branch, it comes from the Bible. Okay, that's supposed to be peace, right? That's from the story of the flood. But all that is taking narrative, and we're making application and reading between the lines to try to understand different lessons for our lives. But remember, this isn't what we're trying to do with this series, right? We're not trying to focus on the story and the human characters and think of all these applications. What we're trying to say is, okay, what does this say about God? What is this story here through these 3 chapters, 4 chapters, 6, 7, 8, and 9, what does this say about God? That he saw fit to inspire it as part of his canon and preserve it in his word for us. What does it say about Christ? Well, let's look at Genesis chapter 8. Now, this is really application to us, but man, it's a powerful one. Genesis chapter 8 and verse 20. Let me read down to 22. So they've come off of the ark. They went forth in verse 18. It says in verse 20, and Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar, and the Lord smelled a sweet savor. We talked about that our thanksgiving, our giving to God's work, our praises to God, the New Testament tells us this is a sweet savor. This is a sweet smell that goes up before the Lord. And this worship, this sacrifice that Noah gives, the Lord smelled a sweet savor. And the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every thing living as I have done, while the earth remaineth. Seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So you have to picture this to understand really what's happening. Noah and his family, they're stepping off the ark. And I mean, we're within days of literally water covering everything, when the birds had to come back because there was nowhere to land. And so he steps off the ark, not to like this brilliant, green, renewed earth, but he's stepping off to see how everything was destroyed. Everything's been wiped away. Everything's been washed off. There's chaos, there's ruin. I don't think that they were coming out necessarily where there were a bunch of buildings and stuff like that. But if you can imagine, if he knew where a building should have been, he looks over, there's no building. Perhaps seeing a few buds sticking up out of the mud, some branches poking from, just piles of mud and broken off tree stumps. Smelling the stink of fish. Perhaps dead animals, perhaps human corpses. And what's his response? And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord. He recognizes his place before God. He recognizes that he has been given grace. And he worships God. And what's God's response? We looked in verse 21. The Lord smelled a sweet savor. He sees this, and what's his response? In his grace, he promises never again to kill all men as long as the earth is to continue. In verse 22 there. He says, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Now that phrase is very interesting. This is not saying, because men will be reformed from this. No, he's saying men will always be like this. God knows men will always have evil imaginations. And that man's heart is evil. Man will always be the way that they were. In Genesis chapter 6. He says, and yet, neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done. And again, verse 22, while the earth remaineth, right? There's a time when the time of the earth is done, okay? But God says, look, in his grace, he looks and he says, I'm not going to do this again. Not because, again, men have changed, not because men will be reformed because of this. We could think, wasn't the wickedness of man great at that time? As we saw in chapter 6 and verse 5. God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. But we see very similar language in Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1 and verse 18 says, for the wrath of God is revealed, from heaven against what? All ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Verse 21 of Romans 1. Romans 1:21. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. You see, there's some similar language there. There's some real similarities between everybody has, wickedness in their heart. Their hearts are full of wickedness. The imaginations of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. To, hey, there's vain in their imaginations. Men are vain in their imagination. Their foolish heart was darkened. And we know what Romans 1 says next about portions of humanity. It says that they worship creation rather than Creator, and verse 26 of Romans chapter 1 says, "For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature." And verse 27, "And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet," which is fitting. The blunt and very in-your-face truth of what is addressed here is perhaps somewhat masked in the language of our Bibles. But what this is saying is that the result of not glorifying true God as God, having vain thoughts and hearts darkened against the truth, is that God then, as a consequence, gives men over to vile affections. They're allowed to go just as far as their heart will go. They are hardened in judgment because of choices that they have made, to desires that are against the order that God created as good and natural. And what is the natural order? Well, Jesus in Matthew 19, verse 4, said unto them, "Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh? Wherefore they are no more twain, but flesh. What God therefore hath joined together, let not man put asunder." The natural order that God created is male and female. Not something between or an accidental body, but God created male and female. The natural order is not, as Romans 1 says, women changing the natural into what is against nature. The created order is not men with men working that which is unseemly, or what is, we could say, is worthy of shame. There's a remarkable thing in our current time, right, in our current society. Or if I say a mathematical symbol and 4 letters, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If I say LGBT plus, everybody in the room knows what I'm referring to. Everyone. You immediately recognize in those 4 letters and the everything else symbol, the plus, the catch-all, that these are now common behaviors. These behaviors that God says are outside of the natural. These are ways that are not the ways God created. And these are things that Romans 1:26 were brought about because for this cause, the cause of rejecting God as sovereign creator, for this cause, God gave them up. Today we're seeing, as very common, a society that looks just like the vile affections of Romans 1. So when we think about what Romans 1 is talking about, and it says, mimicking even the language of what brought about, what precipitated the destruction that the flood was, and we see that God knows in Genesis chapter 8, verse 21, that the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. And yet he promises to hold back from destroying all living things as long as the earth is to last. Then we know that God, this is God in his grace giving this promise. The earth deserves to be destroyed. And in his grace, he has promised to keep in store, to hold together the world until its final end. And it's only because of the grace of God this promise has been made, this covenant has been established with a sign in the heavens. God says, I'm making a covenant and I'm going to give you a sign so that you and I see the sign to hold to because of this covenant. It's only of the grace of God that this promise has been made and first determined in the will of God, in his mind, in the divine will. But then we can see in Genesis chapter 9, to come back to Genesis chapter 9, that God then secures this covenant. And I just made allusion to that. But in Genesis 9, verses 8 through 17, it's a long section here, but we can read it. It says, And God spoke unto Noah and to his sons with him, saying, And I, behold, I establish my covenant with you, and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, of every beast of the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark to every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of the flood, neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the token, or the sign, of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you, for perpetual generations, for everyone to see. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, This is the token of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. So God then, he secures this covenant. He makes it official. He's already decided this in his mind. He's already said, look, in my will, I will never destroy the earth again in this way, with a flood, until the end of time. But he makes this a covenant between himself and the earth, between himself and all living things, between himself and Noah. And he gives a sign, he gives a token of this covenant. And God, he gives a promise, a contract, a testament, a covenant that he would never again destroy all things by flood. And he's just revealing the thoughts that he already has given to the reader. Right? We as the reader have had the opportunity to already see this. And we see that that's no matter how deserving mankind is. No matter of the fact that, look, all men, the thoughts of our heart are evil from youth, from a child. So even though we all think and do evil, wicked transgressions against God, and we therefore deserve any judgment that God would see fit to bring, God promises to hold the earth and its people in store, reserved, as 2 Peter 3:7 says, until time ends and righteous judgment will be carried out. So we come now, again, to our kind of ultimate question. What is the story of the flood and the ark and Noah's family here in these chapters tell us about God? What's the point? Well, if we're understanding this properly, and this would have to be something that would be accessible to the people this was first given to. Otherwise we run a danger of becoming like the Mormons or prophetic cult or even Roman Catholicism, expecting new revelation, binding new words upon all who want to be Christians as God's words, and rejecting what the Bible says when it says the faith was once delivered to the saints. So here, and we read it, I believe the point is Genesis chapter 6 and verse 8. In Genesis chapter 6 and verse 8, what does it say? Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. We think of the story of the flood as destruction. And man, the whole earth was wiped out. And right, if you've seen pictures in Sunday school as a kid, right, it's like the dark sky and the waves and the ark is riding on top. And that's what we think of. And that's true. That is true history. But I think the point is, Noah found grace. God gives grace. God looks and he knows we're always going to fail. And yet in his grace he says, I won't destroy everyone. I won't do it. Even though it's deserved. Even though it is owed. They'll have opportunity. Noah was given grace and saved in the midst of cataclysmic destruction. And God promises to never again destroy all living, nor flood the whole earth. Not because men have gotten better, but because he's gracious and he chooses to give mercy. And so what we're seeing, just like David and Goliath, what did David say the point was? David said the point was that you'll know that God is God. David said, this isn't about me. This isn't about Goliath. This is about God. And we're seeing again that Noah's ark is really not about Noah at all. But it's about the fact that God and his grace gives grace. But what about Christ? Again, we thought about Peter's words from Acts chapter 3 at the beginning of the message. Paul said, right, they knew Jesus not, nor yet the voices of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath day, and therefore they ended up fulfilling the words of the prophets because they didn't understand the words of the prophets. So they made the words of the prophets come to pass. And Jesus said that he opened their understanding by showing the things written in Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, so that they could understand the Old Testament. And so how is Christ spoken of here? How could we say, man, this points to Christ? Well, look at Genesis 9 again. In verses 20 through 24, we have this strange account that really just brings shame to Noah. It really just shames Noah. Genesis 9, verse 20 says, and Noah began to be an husbandman, and he planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders, went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done. And really, we can look at this and we can look, well, it mentions Canaan. So there's other implications of this, okay? I'm not hiding the ball that this is only saying one thing, okay? But, man, you have to picture that Noah in our story at this moment, he's the man who built the ark and saved all of humanity, right? And Noah's descendants, verse 19 says, these are the three sons of Noah, and of them, Noah's family, Noah's seed, Noah's sons, was the whole earth overspread. Every single person from this point on is descended from Noah. Every single person. Right? Do you ever hear stories about, oh, well, Grandpa used to? Imagine the stories about Grandpa here. Man, Grandpa saved humanity. Grandpa, you should see the boat that he built. These would be such tremendous legends that might have been built about a man whose effort saved the human race, whose DNA was the genetic code that continued all life on earth. And yet, right after that, when it says, look, success, everybody is saved through the ark that Noah built. The whole earth, right? It's overspread with the descendants of Noah. It says, by the way, Noah got drunk, passed out in his tent naked, and his kids had to cover up his nakedness. This is a strange account. It seems to just shame Noah. And I think what this account does, more than anything else that could be implied, that we could take as inference or implication here, is it shows that Noah was not a perfect man. He was not the one who would ultimately crush the serpent's head. He was a deliverer. And really, he was the first great deliverer of the human race after the fall. And there's the promise of one who would come to crush the serpent's head. There's a promise of one who is going to come and deliver. But he wasn't the final answer. This record of Noah, If we look at the human character rather than God, it points forward to still the need for another, a Messiah that's still to come. Noah and his ark was the way to life in this great flood. But Jesus said that he is the way and the truth and the life. And so even in Noah, in this great promise, the demonstration of the grace of God, this covenant of God's grace, we are still shown that, hey, this isn't the finish. This isn't the end of it. There's more to come. And there's still another who is going to bring true salvation for all of mankind.